Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wendy and I'm your online church director. If you happen to live close enough, I want to invite you to join us on Sunday at 9:30 or 11 here at our South Ogden campus. If you don't live close enough to attend, I invite you to whconline.com. This is where you will continue to watch messages live, join a chat room anonymously if you would like, but also learn more about online gatherings that may be happening or starting in your area. Stay tuned till the end of the message and I'll tell you more about online gatherings. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your message.
Faith. What is it? Being sure of our hope, convinced of what we can't see. By faith, we understand the world was set in order at God's command. By faith, Abel offered God a greater sacrifice than Cain, and for his faith, God commended him as righteous. By faith, Noah trusted God and constructed an ark for the deliverance of his family. By faith, Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, his only son, believing God would still fulfill his promises. By faith, Moses chose to be mistreated with the people of God, then enjoy sin's fleeting pleasure. By faith, God's chosen nation crossed the Red Sea on dry ground and praised him as it swallowed up the Egyptians. By faith, Rahab the prostitute escaped destruction because she welcomed the spies in peace. Time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, David, and the prophets. By faith, they administered justice, shut the mouths of lions, quenched raging fire. But others were imprisoned, murdered, and wandered in deserts, mountains, and openings in the earth. We are surrounded by this great cloud of witnesses. So get rid of every weight, of every sin, and run. Run with endurance the race set before us. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. He is the champion and guide of our faith. For promised joy, he endured the cross, thought nothing of its shame, and having risen again, has been handed his deserved glory at the right hand of the throne of God.
Well, so glad that you are joining us here this morning at Washington Heights, and for those at the Weber County Jail on Tuesday nights who join us, we're glad that you're with us as we begin a new series entitled His Story. And what we're going to be looking at over the next number of weeks is the Bible. And if you wonder, well, don't we always look at that? Yes, that is true, but we're going to do it a little bit differently because we're going to go cover to cover. One of the more common discussions that I've had with people through the years as a pastor goes something like this. So yeah, the Bible, there's some weird stuff in there, there's some interesting stuff in there, and how do I make heads or tails of all of it? And here is what I would, just promise to you if you sign on for this series here in the next number of weeks as we take an overview of all of it, is that we'll have an understanding of where the key events are, of what each of the books contains really as its big idea. And I think what we'll see from beginning to end is while there are many stories in the Bible tells one story. And there is like that thin red line of God's redemption that runs through all of it. To give us a little picture of where we're going, imagine for a moment that you have a friend who has not seen all of the superhero movies that have come out recently. Okay, they haven't seen the Hulk, they haven't seen Iron Man, they haven't seen Captain America, all the greats of literature, are included in that. And they haven't seen the one movie that promises to bring them all together, the Avengers series. And you have just a little bit of time to get them up to speed. What would you show them? What would you say? And to give us a little picture of what the next number of weeks are going to look like, Here is one website's attempt to do just that. Bring everybody very quickly up to speed about the Avengers. Check out this video.
So there's this super secret government agency called S.H.I.E.L.D., run by Agent Nick Fury. When Loki, the Norse god of mischief, starts, causing mischief, he recruits a supergroup to fight the foes no single superhero can withstand. He calls them the Avengers, mostly because it sounds cool. Now, over the years, the Avengers have gone through more members than Menudo, but right now, we really only have to worry about 7 of them. Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, billionaire arms dealer to his self-made justice bot, picks up most of the checks. Captain America, aka Steve Rogers, genetically modified World War II veteran. The Hulk, aka Bruce Banner, turns into a monster when he gets mad, frequently on probation on account of all the smashing. Thor, aka Thor, Norse god of thunder, sent by his dad to live in a human body as a lesson in humility. Luckily, it's this body. Black Widow, aka Natasha Romanoff, a spy in a catsuit. Any questions? Hawkeye, aka Clint Barton, the world's greatest marksman, totally has the hots for Natasha. Now, at the end of the Thor movie, Loki gets conveniently sucked into a black hole, but it turns out he's found his way to the other side of the galaxy and teamed up with an alien race to come back and take over Earth and gain control of the Cosmic Cube, an infinite energy source currently collecting dust in Nick Fury's Cabinet of Curiosities. So it's time for Nick to wrangle together his dysfunctional family of gods, monsters, and award-winning actors to protect Earth, and we think the odds are in their favor. Who cares if Loki's got an alien army? We've got Robert Downey Jr.
I have successfully privatized world peace.
The Avengers hits theaters on May 4th.
I promise not to talk that fast, okay? But you get the idea that with an overview like that, you can't go in depth with everything, and that's not our goal. Our goal is to get a handle on all of it and to understand it cover to cover. So with that in mind, let's begin right at the beginning and look at the very first verse in the Bible, and here's what we're going to discover from beginning to end. There are many Bible stories, but the Bible tells just one story. And it's a story that has everything to do with you and with me and with everybody else. And so let's go on that journey together. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the Bible's opening statement. And in that, it tells us a lot already that as time began, as we know it, God was already there. So God is eternal. And for finite people like us to get our minds around that, that is an impossibility. But we know a couple of things from this. We know who and we know what. That in the beginning it was God, and what did He do? He created everything that we see and everything that we know. He spoke a universe into existence. Now, a lot of times what people ask, the question that is most often asked around God's creation is, how did He do it? Did He do it in a short amount of time, or did it, unfold over long periods of time? And there are really good and godly people on both sides of that discussion. And in the Bible, we get one chapter really on creation. But you know what the Bible really answers when it comes to questions around this? Not so much about how, but the question of why. Why did He do it? Why did an eternal, infinite God create the heavens and the earth? You go down a little bit further after God, just brings about this creation. How did it all get here? The Bible says God did it. Here's a little bit later in Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let us make human beings in our image to be like us. They will reign over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, all the wild animals on earth, and the small animals that scurry along the ground. And do you notice something about God, that it speaks in the singular? And then you notice how it shifts to the plural. And there is something right at the beginning that is very, very important for us to understand about the character and the nature of God. Theologians have referred to this as the Trinity. It's a word that you will not find in the Bible, but what you do find in the Bible is the expression of a triune God, that there is God the Father, there is God the Son, there is God the Holy Spirit. And many times we wrestle with that, and we have a hard time understanding how there can be 1 and 3 and 3 and 1, and how there is one God, one essence, and 3 persons who all have the essence of God. But right from the beginning, we get this idea, and we think, well, what was God doing before He made the heavens and the earth? God was together in community, as He has been since before time began and will be for all of time. Why did God create? Let us make man in our image. What does that mean? What does it mean for human beings to be created in the image of God? Does it mean that we look like God? And the answer to that is no. And here's how we know that. Here's a definition of God who is inexhaustible, but we're going to try to put it into one sentence. God is an infinite, eternal spirit without boundaries and limitations, with emotions, an intellect, and a will. And for human beings to be created in the image of God means that we also have an intellect, emotions, and a will. Unlike anything else in God's creation, humanity, mankind, men and women and children were made to be in relationship with God. Nothing else has the ability to have that relationship with God like we do. It is the height of creation, not something to get all pumped up about. It was God's idea from the very beginning that He would share the community that He had experienced from before time and invite us into community with Him and also with each other. So in His own image, He created human beings. In the image of God, He created them. Male and female, He created them. Nobody has more of the image of God than anybody else. Every human being is created in God's image. And one of the things that I think that implies for us is that every single person has God-given value. Right? We don't have value because of who we are, what we do. I know we often attach it to that, but there is value that is God-given and was intended to be there right from the beginning. And so God created this perfect world, put a man and a woman inside of that. They had everything that they could ever want, everything they could ever need. And in the middle of where God created all of that, He put one tree off limits. It was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It could have been anything, but it was that tree. And why would God do that? And here's a huge part of what it means to be created in God's image. Remember, emotions, intellect, and will. We have the capability to choose. And God gave us that ability. And inside of that perfect environment, God gave the opportunity to trust Him, to lean into Him, to follow Him. To believe in God is to trust, and the trust is to obey. And so would they follow God and stay away from the one thing that He was very clear will result in a very serious consequence? In the day that you eat of that tree, you will surely die. It was not unclear. And then one day, God's adversary, the devil, convinces a woman, and indications are a man was there too, that God was actually keeping something from them. He wasn't helping them, He was hurting them, and He was keeping something that they would be better off having. And so one day they decided, you know what? We're going to do it. God said it's off limits. We're going to do it anyway. We have everything we could ever hope for and ask for. We're going to do it anyway. And in that moment, exactly as God had predicted and promised, spiritually, there was a death that took place. There was instant separation from God. And there was also some separation from each other. All of a sudden, they realized that they were naked and they were ashamed, and for the first time, they sought to cover that shame from one another. And when God comes calling, here's a pattern that was set into motion. The man blames his wife, the wife blames the devil, and that scenario has been playing out ever since. It still happens. And so much was lost on that day. The perfect world was polluted with sin. And this world of ours that was created not the way that we experience it now, all of a sudden had brokenness and storms and disasters, and humanity had separation from each other, and there was heartache, and there was hardship, and there was difficulty in relationships. Work would become hard, and there would be a struggle in this world of ours. Cats were turned loose, and Tom Brady started winning Super Bowls, and all kinds of things have played out for so long. So much was lost. And a little bit later in the Bible, it tells us that when that happened, that man and that woman were standing in that place as representatives for the whole human race. Ever since that moment, everybody who has been born into this world has been born with a nature that is bent and twisted and broken, and our inclination is not toward God, it is away from God. And we might say, well, I don't think that's fair. I wasn't there. I didn't have the opportunity to make that decision. And I would say, there are things that don't seem fair to us, but they are true nonetheless. For example, I have a nephew who was adopted. He was adopted as an infant. He was born chemically addicted to what his mother was using during the time that she was pregnant with him. I don't think that's fair, but it's true. And he was born with something he didn't ask for. And he's doing great, by the way, but there was a whole process involved in that. We are born, come into this world with that brokenness, that bentness that takes us away from God and not to God. So what is God to do? All that he created perfectly has now fallen. Does he just give up on the whole thing? Here's what it says. That right after that happens, God goes out into that world that he had made, a world that had never experienced the death of anything that was living in it. And God kills an animal and takes the skin off of that animal and covers the man and the woman with that. And it is the first time, but it is not the last time, that the blood of the innocent covers the sin and the shame of the guilty. And notice how it is that God did for people to cover what they had done. That whole pattern gets set in motion, and it's something that we might just title that way. That when it comes to sin, there's a substitution for it. Something that needs to be rectified, something that needs to be addressed, something that is very, very serious. And God went to work. Well, from that point on, things get pretty dark. Here's what it says in Genesis chapter 6. The Lord observed the extent of human wickedness on the earth, and he saw that everything they thought or imagined was consistently and totally evil. Can you imagine a time and a place where that reality exists? And do you know what God did as a result of that? He brought a flood. And that flood was a judgment on a world that was filled with evil. And I don't know if you had this, we had this growing up, where our son in his nursery, we had all these pictures of Noah's Ark and all of that around there with the animals are smiling, a giraffe with a big smile on their face, and I'm thinking, that whole scenario is around something really, really serious in the Bible. And one of the things that we need to know and understand is that judgment is a real thing, that there is a holy God, and there is evil, and holiness and evil cannot exist in the same space. And it's real easy for me to point to the evil that's out there somewhere in somebody else or in some other land or in our own land and all kinds of different things, but one of the hard things for me to acknowledge is that it lives in here too. And if we think, well, I'm not sure I like the God, of judgment, here's a couple things that come along with it. There was time and there was opportunity for people to turn in a different direction. And after a long period of time, that did not happen. You think about our lives here and now and who we are. We have time and we have opportunity. Will we do what is needed before we step into that place where holiness lives? And here we are, bent and broken. So what does God do on the other side of that? Does he just give up now because, man, it got pretty dark? No. He goes to work. And he approaches a man, not because of anything that he had did, but he talks to a man named Abraham, and he says, I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. In fact, God wanted to bless all the nations through this one man. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. Who did God want to bless? Everybody. and he's going to begin with one. And what he's going to do now is he's going to build a nation through which ultimately a rescuer would come into this world who could ultimately make people right with a holy God. Well, after Abraham comes Isaac, after Isaac comes Jacob, and after Jacob comes a man named Joseph who winds up through an interesting set of circumstances in Egypt. A famine hits, his whole family comes down to Egypt, and for the next 430 years, they live inside of this nation, Egypt, and they become a nation. And they began with a handful, and later they are 2 to 3 million strong. And that large population begins to threaten the Egyptians, and the Egyptians put them to hard labor. And God decides it's going to be time now to set his people free. And so he raises up a leader, and he comes to a man named Moses. Why? Because Moses was so great? No, his track record really wasn't that great to that point, just because God chose him. And he spoke to him out of a burning bush. There's this butane bush that will not go out. And God is communicating to this guy and saying, I want you to go down to Pharaoh, and you tell him to let my people go. And Moses says, well, I don't really talk that good. Don't worry, I'll be with you. And he levels all of the excuses that we ever do of why we can't do something, and God says, I will be with you. And then there are these 10 plagues. Each one is worse than the one before it. It's kind of a showdown between the God of the Bible and the God of the Egyptians. And the final one is just the most serious of them all, because it involves really the angel of death passing over. And God, once again, before judgment comes, gives plenty of time and opportunity and speaks quite clearly that here's how you can avoid that catastrophe. Take the blood of a spotless lamb and apply it to the door frame of your home. And when the angel comes and sees the blood, it will pass over. And that's why in the Old Testament that feast came to be known as the Passover, when God did exactly that. Everybody had an opportunity to participate. The Hebrews, the Egyptians, everyone. Not everybody took the time and the opportunity to respond to what God had clearly indicated. And there was tragedy in many homes. Here's what it says now as we shift to the book of Exodus. And you will reply, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. Though he struck the Egyptians, he spared our families. When Moses had finished speaking all these things, the people bowed to the ground and they worshiped. And for some 1,500 years, that event was commemorated. And it's interesting that on the day that we celebrate this communion table, it was 1,500 years after that event when Jesus shows up and he's with his disciples on that final night before he's betrayed and nailed to a cross. And he says, you remember that whole thing? And everybody knew exactly what that was. That ultimately was pointing to me. And I'm the fulfillment of what you saw for so long. The blood of an innocent lamb shed to cover the sin of the guilty. And that's why when John the Baptist saw Jesus one day, he said, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The one who has finally come to make payment once and for all time for the sins of all who put hope and trust in him. And that picture was there way back at the beginning. Well, that final plague finally brings the Egyptians to the point of saying, you can go. And so they leave. 2 to 3 million people just exit this nation called Egypt. And God takes them out into the wilderness, and he meets Moses on the top of a mountain, and he gives the 10 Commandments. And we've all either seen the movie with Charlton Heston up there or the more recent versions of all of that. And here's the way that it often goes with the 10 Commandments. We think, okay, what God did was give the bar. These are the things that you need to do, and you need to clear that bar in order to be right with God. Not the case. Still in Exodus chapter 20, I am the Lord your God who rescued you from the land of Egypt, the place of slavery. And in the next verses, here come the 10 commandments. But do you notice what God said before he ever did that? I am your God. He had rescued them. He had chosen them. He was going to be with them, not because they had lived up to some standard, but simply because of who he is. And so those 10 commandments really became a way for a culture to have the best life together. How do we get along? What are some criteria for that? And so God gave that instruction to the nation that he cared so much about. But remember why he was raising them up? To bless all the nations. So Genesis and Exodus, and now we come to the book of Leviticus. And if you've ever read Leviticus, it's different. Downright strange. And it's one of the reasons that today, even the title of this is called You Lost Me at Leviticus. Because you go through there and there's some strange stuff. It says, don't boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. Anybody guilty of that anytime lately? And I'm thinking, what is that and what does that have to do with people like us? Here's a couple things to know about Leviticus. There are ceremonial laws in there and there are moral laws in there. The ceremonial laws are God revealing himself to a nation who had no concept of who the God of the Bible is. And he also communicates to us, you know what, engaging with God, drawing close to God, worshiping God, it's a serious thing. It's an important thing. And so he gave some criteria around it. And then there were also moral laws, which are the things that we are called to do, to be. Remember, to believe is to trust, and to trust is to obey. And so we might ask the question, well, why don't we do many of the things that are found there in the book of Leviticus? There's a bunch of strange things, and we never bring those up. Why not? Because the ceremonial things that are in Leviticus and other parts of the Old Testament are completely fulfilled in Jesus' coming. They were pointing in a direction, and Jesus is the fulfillment of what was being promised so many years before. But the moral part, who we are, how we're called to live, that stays because it expresses the character and the nature of God. And so, for example, here's something in Leviticus, and this would be one of those moral things. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against a fellow Israelite, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And maybe, if you know anything about the life and times of Jesus, he quotes that part, love your neighbor as yourself. And when he talks about that, loving your neighbor is really old school. It's not something brand new. It's something that God had put out there from the very beginning and given us an indication. What is the character and nature of God? Which direction does it take us? And it takes us beyond ourselves. So Genesis and Exodus and now Leviticus. Now we move into the book of Numbers. What is the book of Numbers about? It is, for the most part, about the Israelites as a nation wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And at the beginning of the book of Numbers, they come to the edge of the promised land. They send in some spies to check out the land, 12 of them all together. 10 of them come back and say, there's no way we can win that battle. Man, there's some big dudes in there. I mean, they could play for the Jazz. There are these giants in the land, and yeah, it's an incredible place, but we're like grasshoppers next to them. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, come back and they say, oh, we can do it. But the majority opinion holds sway, and fear sweeps through the camp. And the people wind up, kind of moving in this direction. The whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night because of this horrible report that they had heard. Look at what they decide to do. Then they plotted among themselves, let us choose a new leader. This guy Moses, he's a loser, and let us go back to Egypt. One of the big themes of the book of Numbers is grumbling. And we might think, well, you know what? In the scheme of things, is grumbling really that big a deal? In light of everything that plays out in this world? Well, according to God, apparently it is. And many years later in the New Testament, the Bible talks a lot about our tongue, our mouth, our words, and speaks hard against things like gossip and slander and dissension and disunity. Because really beneath that, there is a basic distrust of God. Here the people are saying, you know what? Oh man, if we could only be back in Egypt, which by the way was slavery, we'd be so much better off than where God is taking us. And it's an amazing phenomenon that all these years later, sometimes people would choose enslavement over the journey that can be difficult of where God is taking us. So for the next 40 years after this, God says you're going to wander in the wilderness, and an entire generation dies off in the wilderness. And then after 40 years comes the next book, and it's called Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, here Moses is at the end of his time, at the end of those 40 years. They're at the edge of the promised land once again. But remember, it's a whole new generation. And these ones were not there to see what God initially did and what he had said. And so Moses gathers together the whole community, and in a series of messages or sermons, if you will, he basically says two primary things. This is how God has been faithful to us. So as you go forward, trust God. And he also looks ahead and he says, when you're in the land, there are blessings that come with obedience, and there can be the absence of blessing with disobedience. Follow God. When it comes to the book of Deuteronomy, it was one of Jesus' favorite books. It's the second most quoted book in the Old Testament. Psalms is first, Deuteronomy is second. And one of the other quotes that he says many years later, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Loving God is also old school. Nothing new. Been there all along. Revealed by God to give us direction about the way in which we can walk and what it means to be in a relationship with God and also with each other. So all the way from creation to the edge of the promised land. And I want to give you just a couple takeaways before we wrap up for today based on what we've talked about here today. You matter to God. Your life has God-given value. And I believe that that message is so vitally important in our day because I see an increasing devaluing of human life. And the results of that, in my opinion, are catastrophic. From the moment of conception until the final breath, which is God's call to make, every human life has God-given value. And if somebody has ever told you that your life didn't matter, I mean, I've heard of parents that have told their kids that they were a mistake, that they were an accident. And I would just say this, there are accidental parents, but from God's perspective, there are no accidental children. And you have God-given value. You matter to God. And there are a lot of different voices in this world of ours right now and in this culture who would argue against that and set up what really means value. A lot of that is tied to who we are, maybe even what we think. And God says, no, you matter to Him. So much so that God made a way for you to belong to Him. Right? We all come into this world broken, bent, twisted, separated from God. Our inclination is not toward God. So what did God do? God went to work to redeem, to restore, to bring us to Himself. We talked about that guy named Abraham. Part of the story along the way goes something like this. That when God promised that He was going to make a great nation out of him and ultimately bless all the nations, it says that Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. What is righteousness? Being made right with God. How does that happen? Is it because of what Abraham did? No, he believed God. To believe is to trust, and to trust is to obey. How are we made right with God? It's not our doing. It's not measuring up to some standard. It is putting hope and trust in the God who has come to our rescue, and all along the way put this thin red line of redemption of the work that he would ultimately accomplish so that people like us could have hope that is not found inside of us, but it is found in him. And if in the middle of faith you wonder, well, where do I start? Start where Jesus really summarized it. Love God, love people. One day, an expert in the law comes up to Jesus in the New Testament and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment? And I think that's a great question, right? What's the bottom line? How do you net all of this out? What is it really all about? And Jesus quoted from those two verses that we looked at here this morning. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul. He adds a word, mind, and strength. Who is it that can add to the word of God? Well, God can. And he says the second is just like it. Doesn't sound like it, but it is, according to Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus summarizing, what's it all about? That's what it's all about. And all those laws and everything, many of them meant as a flashing neon sign that one day somebody is going to come who's going to fulfill all of this. And also to reveal the character, the nature, the heart of God. There are many Bible stories, yet there is just one story of the Bible. God's thin red line of redemption that runs through it, and it is for everyone. So God's brought them to a promised land. Surely when they go in there, everything's going to be great, right? Well, not exactly. Turns out to be a disaster, but that's where we're going to pick it up next week and see how God continues to journey with people like us. And there's a lot of good news there for us. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me as I pray. God, thank you for who you are. The God who responded to the brokenness of humanity with the personal involvement of yourself. God, right from the beginning, you have given us not what we deserve. You have given us what we don't deserve, your grace, your mercy. But God, at the same time, help us to know that we need to respond to that in a personal kind of way. And perhaps, even for the first time, we need to take hold of that grace and apply it to our own lives, because one day all of us will stand in the presence of holiness. And to be ready for that day, God, we need a righteousness that we cannot find in ourselves and we cannot accomplish on our own. So we thank you for who you are and all that you have done on our behalf. God, lead us closer and closer to you. Give us a greater sense of confidence in you that you are leading us toward life that can only be found in relationship with you. And we ask and pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
I really hope that you enjoyed the message today. And again, I want to invite you to join us next week on Sunday here at our South Ogden campus, or visit us at whconline.com, where you can learn more about online gatherings. What's an online gathering? Maybe right now you're watching from home. Why not next week invite some friends to come along and watch with you, or meet at a coffee shop and watch the message? We believe that location is not a limitation to your church community. By visiting whconline.com, clicking Join an Online Gathering, I will be in touch and we can talk more about what it's going to be like to join an online gathering or host your own. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you guys have an incredible week.